Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you doing?
Doing well, except for the thunder and the lightning.
Yeah.
I walked 100 yards, and I saw lightning and thunder. And with all my experience of being outdoors, I understand lightning can be dangerous.
Yeah.
I chickened out, turned around, went back, and it got much, much worse. But right now we have a little bit, and we're betting that we're going to get through this program without any thunderclaps and not getting struck by lightning.
We're going to talk fast.
We're going to be struck with, brilliance. We're going to come through. Today we want to talk about something, or at least start off with something that you and I have talked about a lot and worked on when we were working in the congressional office trying to stop wars and this sort of thing. And one thing that we had to work on and consider is this casualness and the carelessness of Congress just rolling over for the administration. The founders really believed that if you put the control of warmongering into the hands of the Congress, there'd be less wars. They're closer to the people. And you couldn't go to war unless there was a declaration of war by the Congress. But that is so remote, as it was explained to me once in the committee. Ron, you're just working up a tree. This whole thing that you worry about declaration of war, we don't consider that anymore. That's an anachronism in the Constitution. Yeah. So that was a big lesson for me then. But Congress last week passed one of the repeals, the House, to repeal some of this authorization to use military force, and it has to go through the Senate. And quite frankly, it's sort of like the War Powers Authority would pass the House and even passed over Nixon's veto. So it takes time. So we don't, at least I don't expect magic to happen. There's movement, there's talk. I think the American people would vote for it overwhelmingly, that we have a constitution, and that should be decided. But at least there was one vote, and that's some evidence. But it's something that you might say, well, if we could only write it. I mean, we debated it and tried to make sure the authority was as narrow as possible. But the whole thing is, Daniel, what if we had it really, really tight? We really don't need it.
Yeah. The
tightness should be in the Constitution. And if they don't follow the Constitution, why should we be foolish enough to think they're going to follow this authority? And there's clear evidence. The president's flaunted it. All presidents have flaunted it. Republicans and Democrats. They say, oh, they might criticize the other side when they're doing it, but no, they do it and they justify it because they're owned by the deep state. They're owned by the military-industrial complex. They're not going to stop the warmongering. They might say, well, we don't believe in the war. We just believe in being prepared. Yeah. And if you be prepared, and you'll be protecting national security. So that's where we are today, back on this. And how many years ago? I started in 01 after 9/11, 02 the Afghan war. Remember when Obama came into office? I was sort of like the few things he was saying about foreign policy until he said, well, we're going to end the war in Iraq. But the good war is in Afghanistan. Yeah. It's been so good that it's continued, and still, in spite of these plans by Trump and Biden about getting out of Afghanistan, it's always but we better keep security there. Or like in Syria. Oh yeah, we're leaving Syria. We're out of there. Except we got to protect our oil. There's an oil field up there, and we own all the oil. So, and we have to control the price of oil. Yeah. So a lot of hypocrisy there. But they go through this. But it's better to talk about it. Maybe it'll wake up a couple people and realize that Congress has some authority. But right now, people want to be safe. And if a president says, boy, your national security is at threat, is being threatened right now, do what you have to do. So that's where we are. But we'll see in the next few weeks or months whether or not they ever get around to repealing these authorities.
And this one is about the Iraq War, the 2002 Iraq War authorization. I remember your argument at the time. You were saying before the show you probably went down there several dozen times to the floor to argue against going to war in Iraq. But the authorization, one of your objections to the authorization was that it was not a declaration of war. It just Congress saying to the president, hey, if you feel like going into Iraq, go for it. We don't care. It's no big deal. And of course, he took that and ran with it. But you've also said this a lot. The Iraq war authorization was not a single vote that took place on October of 2002. It was a process. It started, as you always say, in the 1998 Iraq Freedom Act. Remember that? That's what opened the door. And how could you be against that, Ron? We want to give the Iraqis their freedom. And that's how they argued it. And that, of course, was followed by endless war propaganda, lies about Saddam Hussein, who was no altar boy, that's for sure, but he was certainly not what they said. And then 9/11 came, and the whole idea of never let a crisis go to waste. And it reminded me, Dr. Paul, remember your famous Thursday lunches on the Hill? And they were off the record, so I won't say who said it, but we had a very high-ranking military officer address the members of Congress who were there. And he told an amazing story. He was in an elevator with very high-ranking Bush administration officials. And they in the Pentagon were getting ready, to do the war. They were getting ready to respond to Afghanistan right after the attack in 9/11, and they had it all sorted out. And so this military senior military officer told a Bush administration official, "Well, we just about got it sewn up. We're just about ready to go into war with Afghanistan. We got everything ready." And the administration official says, "Afghanistan? What are you talking about? We're going into Iraq." And that's what they were excited about. So that tells you all you need to know is a process,
it
not a vote.
Didn't matter that much. We just need a war.
We need a war.
We just need a war. And how about Bush needing a war? He wrote some pretty dangerous things that to be a great president, you always have to have a war.
Have to have
something
a war.
like that.
Yeah.
But this article that we had looked at, I want to make one point that was in here. It had to do with a quote from Biden. He says, one month after assuming the presidency, Biden ordered a unilateral strike in Syria.
Yeah.
And so that's real recent. That's just this year.
Yeah.
He did that. And of course, you can find some statements where he was going to end the wars and that sort of thing. But he explained his vote. I think he might have been asked a question. Maybe there was an accident and a journalist was in the audience or something. They asked him. He said, well, the Constitution gives me this authority. The Constitution empowers the president to strike any group, anywhere, anytime, as long as he claims it's for national security. And I don't think the writers of the Constitution and the people who were trying to keep us out of war for a long period of time would quite buy into this. But that is a conventional understanding. I mean, the president, he's the commander-in-chief. Yeah, but he's not a commander-in-chief of the whole country forever. Yeah. If there's a war, he indeed is in charge of the troops. You can't have two people directing troops if you have somebody invading your country.
Yeah.
So that's very clear, and I think every time we try to write legislation restraining the president, we always recognize the fact that there are certain authorities when we're in hostilities, not when we're trying to justify hostilities.
Yeah. Well, the article we're talking about is in the Washington Examiner. It's written by Representative Nancy Mace, who took old Mark Sanford's seat, and she's. It's a good article because I think the importance of it is that she makes clear that it's a very bipartisan effort to repeal these wars. And she's talking about the vote to repeal the Iraq War, but she also brings up the 2001 authorization for Afghanistan, making the very important point that every single person that is covered by that 9/11 authorization is either dead, captured, or gone. So the idea that it was used to justify so many wars subsequently, and that's how it works. Libya, Syria, et cetera, and who knows how many troops in Africa it was used to do. So it's important to repeal these for technical reasons, I guess, and symbolic reasons. But I think more important is to repeal the mentality that treats war so cavalierly. That's a tougher thing, I think.
I frequently bring up the subject that the ultimate policies, whether it's foreign policy, monetary policy, spending, deficit, all this is always bipartisan. Ultimately, you get a consensus. But in the meantime, you get a lot of bickering. You do still get, and you're getting more of it, which I think is good, and that is that there's more partisan chipping away at policy. So when Trump was doing something in Syria, dropping bombs and things like that, Democrats, oh my goodness, how horrible, how horrible. But when the Democrats did it, the Republicans, do it. But I think it's just grandstanding. That's just out there, to pretend there's a serious discussion going on, because the troops stay, they keep spending, they never take a nickel out of the militarism that they keep spending this money on, and they just march on, and just think, this whole thing of trying to remove something that's 20 years ago, of giving authority under the conditions of 9/11, and you can't even suggest it. Of course, as you point out in this article, she's not only suggesting it, she's trying to get something done, and that's good. But it's so much easier just to follow the Constitution to begin with. Why have you done it? Changing the policy after you put it in is a lot tougher than just trying to avoid the mistakes that they make constantly.
I wonder if Representative Mace would have come over to your office if you were still there and have some of that free shrimp that Butch Otterwood ate every week.
Don't talk about that.
Those were good. But I guess we move on. There's a piece by our friend Ray McGovern, who was also a speaker at your lunches, and we had him speak on the Hill a couple times, former CIA officer. And he wrote a good piece on antiwar.com yesterday when he talked about the foolishness of the Biden policy toward China and Russia. The idea is really that somehow we're still back in the 70s with Nixon going over and trying to peel the two of them away. So you noticed this piece.
Yeah, this is really amazing, because he was able to speak from experience, because he worked, I guess, with Nixon and went to these meetings, and he said he agreed with him that it was a good idea to try to get because they were both seen as formidable enemies, and therefore, if the Chinese and the Russians were at each other, maybe they wouldn't try to retaliate for the mess that we caused them, and some of the stuff that we pester them about. But he says it's completely different, and he's arguing that Biden is lost in 30 years ago, and I guess there are a few people who might agree with that. But this is not so much a personal attack as much as a understanding on foreign policy strategically that Biden has been left behind on this. And of course, being non-interventionists, we'd like to not be in the conspiracy group that if we can only get the Russians to bomb the Chinese, we won't have to do it, and that sort of thing. But I think it's a very important point, and of course Ray McGovern has been great on foreign policy, and he's one that he's close to being like a realist, that he will change his mind on some. We're a little bit more determined. We like non-intervention, and we want non-intervention unless we are threatened, and indeed making sure that we're threatened before we have to use force in defense.
It's amazing, we talk about it a lot, that when it comes to foreign policy, and I'm almost ashamed of my chosen profession, but there's no new thinking at all. And I think Ray points this out perfectly. The thinking is just rehashed. It's like leftovers from the 1970s, rehashed over and over again. There's no new thinking. The idea, in every time the U.S. has a policy, for example, to weaken Iran, every action that it takes strengthens Iran. And perhaps that's we've talked about it before, perhaps that's just a way of making sure that your enemies are strong enough to justify a continued high budget. But it's just amazing when you think about foreign policy for the actual national interest and how there's just none of that. It's never factored in.
But think about it, though. The staff is on some of these major committees. Biden hung around for a good many years. He probably had the same staff thinking old-fashioned. So staff are sort of static. And then you have the deep state that you can't measure very well because they work in mysterious ways, but they're not likely to change anything. This is all to their satisfaction to keep things going. And then the other place where things don't change is in the professors, how the professors get rewarded that's way in monetary policy. As long as you follow and support the Fed, you get promoted at the university. And as long as I think if you were really creative and thinking, out of the box, you're not going to get promoted at 9 out of 10 universities. So that's part of it. But that's one thing that we're facing constantly is the efforts by the universities to really teach dumb stuff, dumb foreign policy and dumb economic policy, and that's the reason we have that. But we'll do our best to call attention to it.
Well, the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. I remember when I used to go to the committee hearings with you in foreign policy, every single staffer was reading the exact same thing. Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and so they all had the same input. And I used to have a ball taking Lou Rockwell printouts, antiwar.com printouts, and sit there reading it so everyone could see what I was doing just to stir things up. But we want to move on because we want to talk about something that's pretty interesting and pretty important, but in and of itself it is, but it also highlights the deep, deep corruption at the heart of the entire coronavirus COVID-19 enterprise from over a year ago. And this is something that we saw on Summit News via Zero Hedge, written by Steve Watson. And finally, Peter Daszak, the person at the center of the whole gain-of-function research. He's the one that Fauci, he's very close to Fauci. Fauci gave him a ton of money. The Pentagon gave him a ton of money to do this in Wuhan. And then when it came time to investigate the origins of the virus, they hired the guy who was involved in it to investigate himself. Well, finally, he has now been recused from his position at top of the Lancet's UN-backed commission to investigate the origins of the virus. I think because he became such a liability.
You know what that reminds me of? When Kennedy was assassinated, I did not think beyond, he was assassinated. It's horrible, 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 and the nation was in turmoil. And the thought at that, an immediate reaction, I was in the Air Force, I had been drafting, and to suggest, nobody was publicly ever suggesting, could our government be involved in this? That was unthought of, nobody did. But they finally said, well, we have to have a commission. LBJ said, we have to have a commission to study this. And guess who was the key to the commission? Alan Dulles, who turned out to be in deep involvement in all that mess. And I got to thinking, and so the whole thing fell apart. So you put the fox to protect the chickens or something like that. The whole thing here. He was the fact checker. He was the manipulator. So now though he got he helped get Fauci fired or.
Well, he's off the commission investigating the origin of the virus that he helped create. So, but it reminds me of, you often find when a murder is committed, the person who steps up to help the police first is usually the guy who's done it. But something that from the article that I didn't know, which is absolutely fascinating, you touched on it just now, is that Daszak, the guy who was up to his eyeballs in the research in Wuhan, who then secretly manipulated colleagues to write a letter to the Lancet saying that any suggestion that Wuhan was responsible for the release of the virus is an insane conspiracy theory and people should not pay it any attention. They used the then good name of the Lancet to do this, to intimidate people. But what I didn't realize is that he was hired by Facebook as a fact checker. And so he's the guy that went through everyone's posts, and if you said, hey, this virus may have leaked from the lab, boom, you're in Facebook jail, you get your thing pulled, this, that, and the other. And it shows a deep corruption, not only in Peter Daszak, but in the entire social media world as well. So in that entire period, Zuckerberg, probably not him, but someone told him, decided, we know he wrote a lot of love letters to Fauci, decided, hey, we've got to suppress this. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it true? Is it false? We don't care. We don't care about any of that. We've got to shut people up and stop them from even thinking about it. it really exposes the deep corruption in social media.
The fact that there's an adjustment here in personnel is probably good news, because that means more and more people are asking questions. And even though it took a year or so, people are saying, how are we going to get the truth? And when they constantly tell these lies, but I think basically it's good, but I think there needs a lot more house cleaning. It'll be something when you see Fauci and Gates saying, we're going to retire, we're tired of this, and where our reputation's been diminished a bit. So
retire to Guantanamo is where they should retire. But what is interesting is that he did use the Lancet, which you think about it, before COVID, you think, oh, the Lancet, oh, that's a top journal. He used the Lancet's good name to try to discredit this story. We don't know if it was a lab release. We have no idea really, but the idea that he was trying to cover the tracks, and in fact, yesterday the Lancet tweeted this out, and I should have sent it for our clip, but I didn't. But the Lancet itself on June 21st, yesterday, talked about the letter that Daszak was involved in printing. He said, in the letter statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19, published in February 2020, the authors declared no competing interests. Some readers have questioned the validity of this disclosure, so we invite the 27 authors of the letter to reevaluate their competing interests. Peter Daszak has expanded on his disclosure statements for this letter and 2 other pieces of COVID-19 that he co-authored. So they were basically, that's a long way of saying they've been busted.
It is so hard to keep up with who's telling the truth and what's their gimmick. Now, Lancet has a good reputation, like you suggest. You get a Daszak going in there and influence it and taking advantage of it. But I have so much less confidence in the official medical community too. That's dwindling.
Shattered.
Too. Yeah. So it is really tough, because I think that as much as we complain about the internet, there's still a lot of information out there, and bits and pieces of truth always get through somewhere on the internet. It's just that it's being modified tremendously, and you have fact checkers that cancel it out, and people get into trouble, and people lose jobs, so they intimidate people. But still, there are some good people that gets things in there, and that's one thing I keep my fingers crossed with, is that the internet is so big that even Facebook won't be able to control everything that's going on, and Google won't be able to have the control. That people are sneaking in and talking about alternatives, and they're available. They have ways to go, but there will never be a total monopoly of anything as long as there's ability to compete.
Yeah.
And some days, when we look at social media, it looks like our guys aren't getting much chance to compete, but it's out there, so we just have to encourage people to maximize it, because this is the only tool that we have, since we reject the use of violence and aggression and warmongering, is that is talking to people any way you can. There's a vehicle, but still we get some of our information out on the internet. We get challenged too, but I think it's important, truth is the most powerful weapon that you can use.
Yeah, that's true. And we do get stuff out sometimes. And in fact, our last story that we're going to talk about is something that was picked up by Zero Hedge, which fortunately is a bigger website than ronpaulinstitute.org in terms of its reach. So it picked up an article that our colleague Adam Dick wrote yesterday, and it's really an eagle-eye thing, because all along, all the social media, they all say the same thing. If you dare go against the WHO, you'll have your account suspended, you'll have the information taken down, so you dare not cross the WHO. Well, Adam Dick found something very interesting on the WHO website that I bet Fauci does not want out. I wonder if they're going to cancel Fauci. Let's put up our only clip of the day. This is from the World Health Organization website. Advice about getting the vaccine for kids. Look down there at the bottom. Children should not be vaccinated for the moment. There is not yet enough evidence on the use of vaccines against COVID-19 in children to recommend for children to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Children and adolescents tend to have milder disease compared to adults. And then it does say they should continue to have their normal vaccinations that they have as children, but they shouldn't take the COVID jab. Now, you're not seeing this anywhere else, but it's very interesting.
No, and they're getting their information from regular TV, and in spite of the propaganda that comes out in the ordinary sources, there's still a lot of people growing in numbers who are resisting this whole thing. And you know, one thing that's gotten attention, I think, is the fact that vaccines, they're talked in the same thing as passports.
Yeah.
It seems like people understand, you know, passports are something in your body, you know, that if any time there should be a coalition coming together with, you know, good progressives and good liberals who want to protect civil liberties, coming together with libertarians and constitutionalists. Well, what right does the government have to come and say, this is what we're going to put into your body? Of course, they rationalize quickly, oh, this is different, and this is necessary. This is national security.
Yeah,
we
that's
have
right.
to do this for national security. Well, it's a shame, but I think that's great. Adam deserves credit for this.
It's a good find. But you know, again, this is what we talked about yesterday. What will be the recourse for parents that only watch TV? And probably it is their fault. They should reach a little further, but they take their kids down there. They give the kids a shot for a disease that doesn't affect their kids, and then the kids have this heart inflammation and they die. A lot of them are dying. You know, the famous guitar player Eric Clapton has now become very outspoken against the shot. He went to get the shot, and he said he lost the use of his hands, I think, for 3 months. And if you're a guitar player, your hands are kind of important. But he said, they asked him about it, well, you know, did you have any informed consent? Did you know what you were going into? He said, no, all I heard was it's a great thing, you got to go do it. And I thought I was going to die. So hopefully, you know, people will reassess this, especially when the WHO says don't get it to kids. And my final word, Dr. Paul, is just going to be to remind people, check and see if you're subscribed to this channel. If you're not, please do subscribe. We notice that we have a lot of viewers, but we are not increasing our subscription lately to the channel as much as we have in the past. And sometimes people say, hey, I thought I was subscribed, I was kicked off. Make sure you subscribe. Help us grow this channel, get more information out. As Dr. Paul always says, trying to get the truth out as best we can. So thank you for viewing.
Very good. And once again, I would like to thank our viewers for tuning in and the support that you have given us. I do believe that we've made some progress. I think things are better off right now than they were a year ago. There's more truth out there, and there's more resistance building, and people are becoming aware of it. But we still have a long way to go, because right now the propaganda out there is there's a new virus out there, get prepared, and this one is going to be worse than ever. So it's always going to be an enemy out there, and we want to make sure everybody knows there's always going to be a friend out there, and it's the friend of liberty and freedom and people who agree with those issues, because that is the only way that you can work for peace and prosperity, is for people to understand the non-aggression principle. Don't initiate force. We shouldn't do it in foreign policy. We shouldn't do it as individuals. We shouldn't do it in economic policy. But of course, that is the most precise challenge to the Marxists who believe that that you have to destroy the whole society, and that you cannot accept the principle that truth exists. They don't even believe it's possible, so they totally reject it, which means they have license to do and say anything and use any kind of force. So what we're witnessing, even though I think there's been good defense against it, we're witnessing a lot of people who happen to believe because of the concern, and there's reason for concern. I mean, there's a lot of mess out there, and there's going to be a lot worse economic mess and a lot more challenges to our civil liberties. And somebody who comes in and promises, no matter what they're called, oh, we're cultural Marxists, we're different, we're a little bit milder than the old real Marxists. Not true. They're authoritarians, and they come in all flavors, and it has to be attended to by recognizing what true liberty is. And the biggest problem is liberty means you have self-reliance and self-responsibility, and you can't rely on any use of force, and you can't rely on the promises of people in government. That is a fallacy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.